Thank you for attending class today. I'm Jerrel. I develop games for a living. Recently, we have just seen some reports that the demo for Elden Ring running on Switch 2 does not have good performance. This means that the game has a less than desirable frame rate. The frame rate is low, the frames per second, the number of new frames that are drawn for each second. Ideally, we would like that to be at 60. That means within 1 second, the image on screen is changed 60 times. A game has a rendering budget, not in terms of money, but in terms of the power that the hardware has and what the game engine is able to handle. So the more complex things are on screen, the more of the rendering budget is used up. There's also a processing budget as well, but basically the game will run at a choppy frame rate. It'll lower frame rate if the rendering budget is used up. So with Elden Ring on the Switch 2, I will link to the video where Nintendo Life was explaining their experience, particularly Felix. And they explained that the frame rate was not good, especially in areas that are densely populated. Bandai Namco was not allowing people to record video of this, which shows that they are not confident in showing people what this looks like. So it is an admission that the performance of the game is not great right now. So I want to share some of my perspective on that as a developer, why it would be happening, the poor frame rate, and why it's most likely not a big deal. And by the time that the game launches, it's most likely going to be improved significantly to where it's not a big deal. So we have games like Cyberpunk 2077 running on the Switch 2, and it runs great. There are a couple areas that maybe don't run as well, but they still run acceptably. So Cyberpunk 2077 is the benchmark, the example of a visually complex game that can run well on Switch 2. So why isn't Elden Ring running great on Switch 2? The game engine that was used to create Elden Ring is a proprietary engine. Well, it's conflicting information around online, but they say that it is a heavily modified version of an engine that is provided by Sony. So it is something that had a starting point and then has been heavily modified over the years. So it is basically a proprietary engine at this point. So the difficulty with that is that engines need to be updated and customized for each particular game platform that they run on. Just because a game engine is able to produce something for the PC, for the PlayStation, for the Xbox, it does not mean that you can just add a button and say, make a Switch 2 version. There's a significant amount of work that needs to go into customizing and adjusting that framework, that game engine, so that it takes advantage of a new platform. Every game platform, every hardware configuration has a unique set of quirks, and the strengths and weaknesses are unique to that console, and it takes time to figure that out. If you have a large team developing your game engine, say for example with Unity, Unreal, and other engines, then you can have a team specifically working on finding out the incompatibilities between your game engine and your game platform, your hardware, and then that game engine team can then work and improve and fine-tune the engine and say, okay, so we found that these particular shaders, for some reason, they don't work well, they have bad frame rate on the Switch 2, so let's go ahead and make a custom version of that shader. Let's fine tune that. Let's adjust it so that it does work better on the Switch 2. They can say, oh, for some reason, for each loops, when we iterate and with a for each, for some reason, it causes memory leaks, and that's, causes the frame rate to drop. For some reason, using 3D audio, the built-in 3D audio, that causes a huge drop in performance on the Switch. So it is the job of the engine development team to find that and then make improvements. When it comes to proprietary engines, there isn't necessarily as big of a team working on that. There isn't necessarily resources allocated specifically to tailoring the engine to specific platforms, because that is not something that they need to do very often. It is something that only needs to be done when a new platform launches, and then they have the engine development team working on that. But then once that's all improved and done, you don't necessarily need to allocate a significant amount of resources to that. So in the case of Elden Ring, Again, I don't have any insider knowledge. I do not have a Switch 2 development kit myself, so I'm free to speculate. I don't know anything about the Switch 2. I know nothing, and nobody tells me nothing. So, with Elden Ring, I believe it's a case that the whatever team they have developing the engine, they are still working on fine-tuning and adjusting the proprietary engine they use for Elden Ring. They're still working on fine-tuning that for the Switch 2. As we saw with Cyberpunk 2077, early footage shows that the gameplay was a little bit rough when it came to the frame rate, but the end product was quite good. That shows that they kept improving. I'm not sure if they were improving things on the engine side or if they were just working on the game itself. Now, when it comes to bringing your game to certain platforms, there are things that you can do as a developer outside of the game engine where you have to tailor your game and fine-tune it for a specific platform. When I brought my games to 3DS, Wii U, and Switch, they all had really weird specific quirks. Even though the game engine worked, there were certain things that just were problematic, even though they were not supposed to be. So as a developer, it's up to you to put your product in a functional state on the hardware. And when you see that there are performance issues, you then, by process of elimination, through experience, and through intuition, you need to determine what is causing the problems, what is causing the frame rate to drop. And it's a process of elimination. You isolate different aspects of the game, different elements, and you section them out, and then you make certain, okay, I've found exactly what's causing the performance issues. There isn't a real reason why there should be a performance issue. There just is, because again, every game platform, every hardware configuration has a unique set of quirks. So you find what's going wrong, and then you find a workable solution. You need to figure out, okay, if this doesn't work, what is another way we can achieve this particular visual effect? What is a way that we can achieve this thing programmatically, but do it in a way that works in line with the weird quirks of the console so that we don't get frame rate drops, we don't get memory leakage. And that is a huge part of the porting process. There's so much that goes into it. There's always going to be things that should work from the game engine standpoint, but for some reason, they don't work on Switch, Switch 2, PlayStation, Xbox. It's your job as a developer to find that and then to come up with a solution, an alternate way to achieve some sort of expected end result when it comes to the game. So obviously with Elden Ring, it's quite a complex game. It's very demanding. And through the report with Nintendo Life, they explain that when they are in detailed, dense areas, the game really slows down. There's a lot of different things that could be going into this, and it could just come down to polygonal density. Obviously, more polygons on screen. Every 3D model is comprised of polygons. The more polygons that are on screen, the more the hardware has to work and the bigger the cost for rendering. It could be down to polygonal detail, but it sounds like, because they explained that when they were in a forest, the frame rate really dropped. So when it comes to a forest, we're using a lot of geometry that has transparent pixels. We have trees, and the trees themselves, the leaves are not modeled. The leaves are textures. And that is more expensive. Having a transparent or semi-transparent material is more expensive than opaque material. Opaque material is something that has no transparency to it. You start adding in things like fog, particle effects, and transparent particles when it comes to fog and atmospheric lighting have a significant cost. And the more effects you have on those, the more that the rendering cost will be. You may have multiple sound sources, having to stream multiple audio files. You can have anything that is programmatic that comes to collision checking, logic checking. All of those things come into play, and when you have just one small area, a game can run fine, but scalability is where things can become problematic, is when you have many of these objects that on their own they work just fine, but when you have a huge amount in a small area, then that becomes problematic. So the Switch 2 is quite powerful. It relies on upscaling DLSS to increase its resolution to 4K. There are a number of approaches that they could take to improve the performance of Elden Ring. There are things such as depth of field, where things in the background are blurry, things in the foreground are sharp. That generally is quite expensive when it comes to rendering, but you can actually have that particular effect render at a lower resolution than the actual game itself. And because things in the background are kind of blurry, it doesn't really matter that much. And it is worth it. You can half that resolution and actually get a significant performance increase. Things like bloom, where you have light pixels intersecting with dark pixels, and there's a halo effect that is blurring between them. That can be quite expensive. Again, I don't have a Switch 2, but on the Switch, that was generally quite expensive. On other platforms, it's quite expensive on the rendering cost. So you can render bloom at lower resolution. You have volumetric lighting, which makes the environment and atmosphere look like it has density into it, like there's moisture or dust particles in the air. Volumetric lighting is so beautiful to look at, but it's quite expensive to render. The Switch 2 should have no problem rendering that. But if you render it at a high resolution, it can be problematic. And again, your volumetric lighting, you can render that at a lower resolution. That doesn't mean that the overall game is a lower resolution. That means that effect can be rendered at a lower resolution, and you can have a massive performance increase by lowering the resolution of that effect when it's rendered to the camera. Those are a couple things that the developers could do, but they are obviously experts. They know exactly what they're doing, but it's a matter of fine-tuning their game engine so that it can take advantage of the Switch 2's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. So those are my thoughts on that. That's what I wanted to share with you. I hope you found that interesting. And I'll put some links in the description again to Nintendo Live discussing their experience with it. Thanks very much for spending some time with me today. I hope you enjoyed hearing about that. Be well, and we'll see you next time.